Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Van, and I'm the Executive Director at SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation at McMaster University. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, a hidden universe of uncertainty with Nate Breznau. I'd like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us, and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. We are thrilled to be welcoming Nate Breznau, who's a social scientist and principal investigator of 3 third-party funded projects at the University of Bremen. The most recent is investigating the role of theory in resolving the reproducibility crisis. His studies of public opinion and social policy brought him to becoming a researcher and advocate of open science and meta science. We are thrilled to welcome you here today, and take it away, Nate.
Yeah, thanks so much. I will share my screen here. And thanks so much, Allison and Lynn, for the invitation. And before the invitation, I didn't know about SPARC, and it sounds like a really cool place with lots of research directions that are near to my own heart, so to speak. And with that said, I start the show. Hopefully that looks good to everybody.
Looks great.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking to you today in particular about uncertainty. And I do want to say that this presentation is going to be about work that was done with my co-principal investigators, Eike Mark Rinke and Alexander Wutke. You can see their photos on the screen there. And let me start off by saying that a lack of uncertainty is quite rare in science. So this is just to contextualize kind of everything I'm going to present to you today and what we're going to be talking about. I've put something where there is not a lack of uncertainty, and that is the levels of carbon in the atmosphere, which are obviously related to human activity. Recently, the spike you can see at the end of the graph there in the last 50 years. But this is an exception. In most areas, there's just a lot of uncertainty. Let's put it that way. To start with, let's have a quick review of why there is uncertainty in science. And I guess one of the biggest and most well-known reasons is measurement error. Measurement error is everywhere, and it's always present in science. And measurement error, as most of us, maybe psychologists want to measure depression. They know that depression exists, and they have a set of symptoms which can help them identify depression. They can't measure depression directly, but they use these symptoms to try to get at it. But by using these symptoms, there's inevitably types of error. Or maybe a more fun example, SpaceX wants to land rockets right side up, which is something when I was a kid, no one had ever even heard of. And of course, the first many times they tried to do this, the rockets crashed and exploded and tipped over and everything. And that's because all of the data they were trying to use to land those rockets had too much noise in it, too much error. There was too much uncertainty. And only over time were they able to collect enough data to land a rocket right side up. So I think most of us know about measurement error. There's another source of uncertainty in science, which has become much more well-known, especially among social and behavioral sciences in recent decades. And that's what I would roughly call systematically distorted research practices. And as you can see in the cartoon, something like fudging the data would be something that someone does. And the reason we have these systematically distorted research practices is because in science, we have what I like to refer to as perverse incentives. These perverse incentives are that in order to advance in a scientific career, one has to seek status and fame and maybe get published in certain journals and engage in certain activities that generally don't have a lot to do with science or the scientific method in and of themselves. And this seeking of status as a way to forward one's career can lead to behaviors that are maybe anti-science. And some of those are falsification. You can see the names of some infamous scholars on the screen here. In the word cloud, the size of the name is a function of how many retractions they've had. And many of these are in the so-called hard sciences, but we've had a famous case, a Dutch social psychologist who won't name here, but who had 52 papers retracted because basically he was faking data his entire career. And he consumed millions of dollars in public funds in the process and had a negative impact on a lot of PhD students whom he supervised as a result of being found out. And I would say this is a product of perverse incentive. There's also hacking, which is maybe a softer version of blatantly faking data, but running 5 experiments and only reporting 2 because they fit, or running a model that tests some hypothesis, not liking the results, tinkering around, finding a model that fits the results, presenting that model as if it were the first model. Hacking. I always like to give a little, let's call it plug for open science in my talks these days, because I think it's really important that we recognize that there is a kind of crisis going on in science right now because of what we're becoming aware of through meta-science. Just one more factoid on that. There was a study by John et al., and it's a bit old by now. It's almost 10 years old, or over 10 years old. And it was a study of psychologists, and psychologists themselves reported in this study, 22% had admitted that they rounded down the p-values in their results when reporting them. They did selective result reporting, so it meant that they ran several tests or experiments or whatever and only reported some. And even 2% actually admitted to just blatantly faking data. Now, when asked about what they thought of their colleagues and peers in this regard, they really thought they were heavily engaged in these behaviors. 98% were said that they thought their colleagues were selectively reporting results, and 37% falsifying data. So we have some perverse incentives. I think you're all familiar with publish or perish, and unfortunately, a good supervisor is going to tell you as a PhD student or upcoming student that you will have to publish or you won't make it. And that's true, at least today. So we know a lot about those by now. And what I'm going to talk about today is a third one that is maybe less well known, and that's what I might call unsystematically distorted research practices. And these are things that are random variability, researcher variability, or some have even said dark uncertainty in the research process. Let's unpack that a little bit more. The idea is that there's idiosyncratic variation across researchers. Imagine you did a study and you're early in your career and you did a study and you used some data and you ran some tests. And then it's 20 years later and you want to do the exact same study. Would you get the exact same results? That's a good question. Would you even approach doing the study in the same way? What if you had the exact same data and the exact same hypothesis? It's an open question. And I am of the opinion now, based on what I've seen, that there is some kind of idiosyncratic researcher variability that may generate more uncertainty in science than we are aware or would like to admit or know about at all. And what I mean by idiosyncratic variation is things that are undeliberate, maybe a product of context. For example, some universities use SPS for statistical software. Some universities use Stata. They only have certain licenses, so the students end up using those software that they have a license for. Maybe they only have access to certain data. Maybe they were trained in a way that had to do with their methods training, and they just do things out of habit without actually thinking about them. Or maybe we might just call it spooky variance. So spooky is like what Einstein said when referring to how quantum wave particles behaved. Here's a really basic example. On the x-axis, these are some data. On the x-axis is wealth, and on the y-axis is happiness. And if you look at the data points by themselves on their own, it looks like with more wealth, there's less happiness. Interesting. So some researchers might look at these data and come to the conclusion that there's some kind of negative association, or even that more wealth causes less happiness, more money, more problems. Could be. However, if you look at the age groups and look within these different age groups, it's clear that there's actually a positive association, but there's probably some other confounding factor of age in there. But in this simple example, the point is that depending on how you look at the data, you might come to different conclusions. So that's a simple example. We're going to take this to a much more complex example and ask the research question: what happens when many analysts, so researchers, test the same hypothesis with the same data? And this is actually an emerging method in all facets of science. They've become known as many analyst studies by now, I would say, is the name we've settled on. And the first one that I'm aware of that kind of kicked it off is the Silbertson et al. Study, which looked at football penalty cards, so soccer, to see if referees were skin tone biased. Were they giving more penalty cards to darker skinned players? And they had 29 teams of analysts. And then a few years later, Botvinnik-Nezer et al. Did something similar, but with totally different data in a totally different context, with fMRI data, so brain scan data. And they had 70 teams, and they analyzed brain scans that were undertaken when participants were doing different tasks. We have our study, which I'm going to present to you, which looks at secondary survey data, policy preference data in particular. And then along later came a Menkveld study, Menkveld et al., and they looked at futures trading data in Europe. And they had 164 teams analyzing the data. And then very recently, Gould et al. They were interested in conservation, and they had agricultural ecology data. So very diverse studies. There are many more as well, but these are some of the largest, or the first, that I'm reporting to you here. And what these studies have in common is that the researchers, the many analysts, they really did stuff that went in all directions. They had models that were very different. They approached the data differently, even though they were given the same hypothesis in all cases, or hypotheses. Sometimes there were more than one. And the results went in all directions. The conclusions went in all directions. And it was very surprising because in most cases, especially in the earlier studies, the researchers thought, like we thought, we're going to learn something here. We're going to learn about why is there disagreement? Why do we have so much uncertainty? Why do we have a lack of consensus in our particular subfield? So this is the paper that we published, is reporting the main findings of our study that I'm now going to present to you. And of course, I have to give credit to our participant co-authors. They were promised authorship. It was a nice incentive. We were able to use the perverse incentives to the favor of science here to get people on board to participate in our study. And there are many of them in 73 teams, 1 to 3 persons per team. And there were 2 things about our study that were really important for us. One was we were going to use secondary survey data. So we were going to use data that were publicly available. Many of the researchers in our study had even seen these data before and worked with them. That was different. Previous many analyst studies used data never before seen. Also, we thought we'd try to track all the steps in the research process. And by doing so, we could explain why there might be different results and what were maybe some key moderating decisions in the workflow that led to those different results. The previous studies, and actually even the following studies, had just taken a few aspects of the researchers, like a couple choices that they were able to measure. So essentially what we did was a qualitative investigation on the back end of everything, which took actually many years, of each team's workflow and all the different decision points and different aspects of the workflow. Again, 73 teams, 1 to 3 persons per team. They were given one hypothesis, that immigration undermines support for social policy, or so immigration reduces, you could say, support for social policy. And what the teams gave back to us were 1,261 models, an average of about 12 models per team, and 88 subjective conclusions. Some teams had more than one subjective conclusion. I'll come to that in a minute. We wanted ecological validity. We wanted to observe researchers in their natural habitat of doing research. So we tried to have as little that we dictated to the researchers as possible. But for obvious reasons, we had to give certain criteria. So the same hypothesis. We also gave them 6 questions from the International Social Survey Program's Role of Government module. And these questions were, on the whole, do you think it should or should not be the government's responsibility to? And then there were 6 items relating to different types or different aspects of what you might call the social welfare state, like jobs or healthcare, old age care, etc. We also gave them 2 test measures of immigration measured as stock, so percent foreign born, or flow, which is net migration in a year, so out minus in migration. So the researchers were then free to do almost whatever they wanted, as long as they tried to test the hypothesis on those 6 questions. But whether they combine those 6 questions into a scale, whether they dichotomize the answers to those questions, that was left up to them. Also, we discouraged them from bringing in too much extra data, but we said if they really thought other outside data was absolutely essential for testing the hypothesis, they were allowed to do that. And some did bring in outside data, for example, asylum seeker data or non-Western immigration versus just purely immigration or foreign background. Okay, so we got all the results in. We checked them for replicability. That took a very long time. We anonymized the results. So we redacted identifying information from the workflows of the teams from the statistical code, like a good qualitative analysis, because not all teams agreed to have their names attached to the code that was shared. Therefore, we had to anonymize all of it. We asked them to give us average marginal effects, but not all teams gave exactly what we were asking for. So we had to go back and re-standardize the effects to try to make them comparable. I would say it's not really possible to make them perfectly comparable. This was a big issue for us. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, because some people subset the data differently. Some people might have weighted the data. And so it becomes quickly very difficult to standardize. We have 2 different test variables. We asked for their substantive conclusions, support the hypothesis, rejected the hypothesis, or they thought the hypothesis was not testable given the data. So we did our qualitative coding of the model specifications. I say specifications in quotes because there were choices that they made, measurement, estimation, things like that, subsetting the data. But we also measured features of the research process, which maybe weren't exactly choices, like which software they were using. We measured their prior beliefs and attitudes before the study. Did they believe the hypothesis was true? What were their attitudes towards immigration in general? We measured things like what was their technical experience, so methodological skills, how much experience they had with the topic. We also, after they submitted their models, but before they submitted their results, we asked each team to peer review 5 or 6 other teams' models and give a ranking. So we had some kind of subjective ranking of the whole system from peers. We were able to identify 107 possible decisions or specifications made during the research process that were common to more than one team. That was important because if only one team made a particular decision and we use that as a variable to try to understand uncertainty, we're then using a variable that uniquely identifies a team. And that doesn't work so well. That could just be a random intercept then. So these were variables that were taken by at least 2 teams, ideally 3. When we looked at all these 107 decisions across the 1,200 plus models submitted, in the end, actually every workflow, every set of specifications was unique for every model. And this is what the results look like. They're very complicated when you get down to the nitty gritty of things. But if we just look at the point estimates for now, we can plot them here and see that they run the spectrum from negative to positive. And when considering a 95% confidence interval, the orange lines, which represent point estimates, not confidence intervals, the orange color indicates those were significantly less than 0 with the 95% confidence interval, so did not overlap 0. Gray, the confidence interval overlapped 0. Blue, a positive point estimate, so opposite direction of the hypothesis and not overlapping 0. And you can see the weighted percent of the distribution. Weighted is important because some teams submitted one model and said, this is it. This is the data generating model. We believe in this model. This is our model. And other teams said, we don't know. We have no idea. And we think it's prudent to run 96 models. So for the team that ran 96 models, we, of course, inversely weighted these here. And what happened? A slim majority were not statistically significantly different from zero at 57.7%. About a quarter were negative and different from zero, and less were positive. With their subjective conclusions, you can see the diamonds above. These are subjective conclusions. A little more than half rejected, said, we conclude that we reject the hypothesis. That is not true based on our results. There were a number of teams in gray that said, you know what, it's just not testable given these data. And other teams said, yeah, we found evidence in support of the hypothesis. Now, some teams said, what? Stock of immigration and flow of immigration, they're really different hypothesis tests. And therefore, we submit two different conclusions because in one case, we support the hypothesis, and in another case, we rejected it. And so again, we wanted the teams to have their own research. We wanted to observe them in their own research conditions. And so this was important that we said, okay, if that's what you insist, you're the researcher here, we will just take your results. Below the diamonds, you see these sort of heat bars. These heat bars show an association of different variables with the team conclusions. The top bar, for example, I think I can, do I get the red here? Oops, let me get the red. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, I'm not getting the red. Anyways, look at the top bar, percent of positive test results. That means that if they had a significant negative effect at 95% confidence interval, this is coded as a 1. And you can see the lighter color is more associated with supporting the hypothesis. Here you see a kind of clear pattern, which we would expect, but everywhere else that they believed the hypothesis was true, that they were pro-immigration or not in the beginning, that they had more topical knowledge, there wasn't much of a correlation with any of these things. Okay. Here we thought about, maybe it's not exactly the results that the teams that we want to know about, but we also want to know about the variance. So how much variance was there within teams? Of course, the very few teams that submitted a single model, there's no variance, but they were very rare. Most teams submitted about 12 models. And you can understand why, because there were 6 survey questions and 2 test variables. So these teams said, you know what, we're just going to run each test variable with each survey question. 2 times 6, 12. There's our results. So we looked at the within team, we looked at the between team and the within team variance and tried to see if we could understand this as well. And there wasn't much of an association. So if you look, for example, at prior beliefs is whether they believe the hypothesis was true. If you look at the within team variance, there's a slight difference between those who really believed the hypothesis was true, the orange, and those who did not previously believe the hypothesis was true, the blue. But despite a slight sort of mean difference, the distribution of the point estimates, they're still very much overlapping here. So no big findings here about explaining variance. So this is really our main figure. I'll just spend a moment on it to try to clarify what's happening. Each bar is 100% of the variance, and the top bar is the total variance. So that's all the variance in the point estimates that the team submitted. And we said, okay, we're going to use these 107 specific model specifications and try to explain the variance. So we regressed the variance on these specifications. And what we found was that the assigned conditions, there was an experiment at the beginning of the study that isn't really related to our findings here, but we wanted to make sure it didn't bias the results in any way. The assigned conditions, the research design in green, and the researcher characteristics explained just under 5% of the total variance in the top bar. The between team variance, we were able to explain closer to 20%. And a lot of that had to do with research design. So some teams dichotomized the dependent variable and other teams didn't. And decisions like this actually do explain some of the variance on average between teams. But strangely, within teams, a lot of the decisions didn't seem to matter, like which dependent variable they used, or which test variable they used, or how they maybe differently used an estimator. Some teams used like a multi-level model in some models and then a simpler OLS model because they thought it's less biased and we should test that as well. The bottom is the subjective conclusions. So this is explaining deviance, which is basically the variance in a binary outcome. And here we were able to explain some of the between team subjective conclusions. And we could explain about 25% of that when we added in whether they got a positive test result or not. But what's striking here is in a lot of cases, we have 80, 90% of the variances unexplained by all these decisions, which we were able to code and identify qualitatively. So we wanted to know, is that a lot? Is that a lot of variance? We weren't sure. So we ran a multiverse analysis, which is we ran our own set of many models using one team's workflow, basically. And very quickly, we could explain about 16% of the variance in a single workflow, right? But in our real world setting of our study, we could explain less than 4% or less than 5%. And we tested things like a variance function regression. We set up an algorithm to test all possible combinations. And what was really important here is that we could, of course, explain all the variance if we put in all 107 variables and added like team intercepts and et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that we're overfitting the model then, because remember, we only have 73 teams. And when we uniquely identify team with variables, we start to run into a problem. So if we put in 72 variables, we've uniquely identified every team with a single variable. And we really wanted to know, we weren't just blindly trying to explain as much variance as possible. We wanted to know, is there like a unique choice that's really important that we might look at causally to say, hey, this matters a lot. And we weren't able to. And we ran some random forest models as well to let them try to guess the outcomes, and they didn't do any better than our own regression analysis. So the big finding here is 73 teams of 163 researchers submitted 1,261 unique models. And for them, these models were honest and best tests of this hypothesis, in their opinion. And many of these researchers are professors, many postdocs, also PhD students. Many have published in the area, and many have very extensive methodological skills and subfield experience. Yet, total disagreement. All models were unique on some aspects. And we weren't really able to explain why. So if you struggle to work with our data, which we have an online repository, of course, or maybe you don't work with R, we have a 100-page technical appendix that goes with our thing. We built an app so you could play around with the data yourself. So you could choose different decisions that were made by the teams and see how they might affect the results. It's a Shiny app made in using R. So coming to conclusion, and of course the Q&A, which I look forward to, we've called this something like a hidden universe of uncertainty. Universe, it's been debated a bit on Twitter and other presentations. Is this really a universe, or is it more of just another continent, or et cetera? Could be an overstatement, but we just don't know. The point is that we were surprised, and as were many analyst studies surprised, to see that there's so much uncertainty. And the reality that we need to accept here is that different researchers performing what seems to be identical tasks are prone to variability. There's going to be noise, randomness, idiosyncratic variability. And because of that, we should probably try to communicate this type of uncertainty in addition to measurement error and in addition to trying to reduce these sort of perverse incentives that may affect the way we do our science. So here's a quote from Alfred North Whitehead. In formal logic, a contradiction is the signal of defeat, but in the evolution of real knowledge, it marks the first step in progress toward a victory. Oh, what does that mean? How are we going to make progress here? I think we can simply say, okay, we've now know about this other type of uncertainty that is associated with the researchers themselves through no ill will or perverse incentives, or even deliberately, they come to different results, especially in a study where things are really complex. And a lot of these studies, things are quite complex. Brain scans, survey data, football referees, a little less complex actually, but still the data generating model might be quite complex. So the truth is, we're not going to necessarily come to better knowledge by running more models, or by running all possible models and then looking at them. We may not really figure out what's going on. And that, to me, suggests we need to work especially hard on theory, because there's going to be areas where through data, we're not going to get the answer that we're looking for. And in particular, in sociology, political science, we have a lot of areas where we can't do experimental research, right? Experiment is great for testing hypotheses and developing theory, but we don't have experimental data where we can take 30 countries and randomly assign them to a treatment and a control and observe them over 200 years and figure out what's going on. So we will need to work on theory to resolve some of these issues, to get a better data generating model in the first place before running so many models. And why is that important? This new genre of research, these many analyst studies, they're extremely costly. The Menkfeld et al. Study actually measured how much work the teams did. We asked our participants, but we had quite large categories for them to tick in the survey. But they took the exact amount and they calculated that it took 27 full-time equivalent position years for them to complete the study. So that's a lot of work, and we have to weigh the gains against the costs here. And finally, I would say that on a positive note, we can exercise more epistemic humility. What do we learn to do as researchers? What we learn to do is that we need to be salespeople. We need to really sell our ideas to get noticed, to get a job, to get funding, to get advanced, to get cited, etc. And in becoming salespeople, we easily overstate our findings and easily overstate the meaning of what we found and the reality and the truth. And these many analyst studies show us, if somebody else came in and did the same study, they'd probably get different results. It's very likely. And we should exercise a little bit more of what we're calling epistemic humility when we present our results. We should acknowledge that there is this other form of uncertainty. And on that note, I will stop there. And again, thank you for your attention. And I can stop
Thank
the
you so
screen
much,
sharing
Nate.
as well.
All right, we're excited to get started. And there are actually, to start, 2 questions in the chat from Grant Gibson. I'm happy to read them to you if that's helpful.
Maybe it's good for the recording.
Okay. Does this provide first question, does this provide a framework for assessing power in meta-analyses, especially because you were able to go some way to quantify explanation of variance?
Okay, does this provide a framework for assessing power? Theoretically, yes. This is something I haven't explored a lot, but it sounds like a good idea, because we have an estimate of the variance that might occur across researchers in this particular subfield, but in many other subfields and many analyst studies. So with the knowledge of that variance, I believe we could plug that into some kind of power calculation, or even a meta power calculation. So not about the population sample, but about the researcher level population sample. I hadn't thought a lot about that, but I find it a potential area to pursue. If that didn't answer your question, please feel free to clarify more.
Because that was my thinking too, that you would need to estimate the distribution of the variances from the other studies you cited.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so we
I'm
could
happy
get,
to talk even if I don't come on
Oh,
camera.
yeah,
I
please.
think it's super interesting just to see, because your R square for most of it was so small compared to what I would have expected. You look at meta-analyses as being the gold standard, but if you're talking about a meta-analysis with 14 papers in it versus one with 32, like knowing that underlying variance in possible people looking at exactly the same thing, huge problem, but it sounds interesting.
Yeah, in a non-quantitative sense, I can just say that the problem really rests is a degrees of freedom problem. If you think about 107 specifications, let's just say that's average for any research, any research paradigm. The possible combinations is huge. And so we would need thousands of research teams in order to really, get at what might be driving results. But in a way, it was an empty cells problem.
I think that
But yes,
anticipates my second question.
using the just real quick, using the R squared though, that would be really cool. So we've got a kind of meta power analysis where we say this is the R squared, so this becomes our target estimate that we want to get, and then we could use that to calculate how many teams we might need. And I'm not aware that any of the many analyst studies have done this in advance. We did a power analysis in our study, but it was a little bit different because we had a treatment at the beginning of the study because there were two different studies that took place in this study, which I also don't recommend because the participant fatigue was really high at the end. But yeah, that would be something that could contribute to many analyst studies doing a power analysis in advance. Next question. Yeah, I cut you off there.
No, that's okay. I think you highlighting that it's a many cells problem anticipates my next question is what role would an AI play in helping to understand the scope of this problem?
Yeah, so we understand AI today as being able to help us with the sparse data problem. I admit to not being a super expert in this area, although I'm working a little bit with natural language processing. We ran some sort of brute random forest models. The problem is that we think we have the answer in multiverse analysis because we could theoretically simulate all these different model specifications in a multiverse analysis and then analyze that. And that takes way less effort than what was done in the many analyst study. But the reality is that real research is much more messy than what we do in a single pipeline multiverse analysis. So a proper multiverse analysis would have to be like different softwares, a sort of different, you might have to even have a random noise generator in there to simulate real researchers. And this isn't a real viable solution because it turns out real research is just messier than simply the models that were there. I'll give you a good example. I especially replicated all the findings of all the researchers. And one team, we kept going back and forth and we were like, why doesn't this replicate? And we finally figured out they were using M plus version 7 and I was using M plus version 8. And the underlying defaults had changed because the methodological technology or what was accepted as the best practice in these maximum likelihood estimators changed. And so they changed it. And so the results changed slightly, even though we use exactly the same M plus code.
That's good. I finally have a real world example of that because I often say that this is possible, but I hardly ever run into it. So that's good to have an example. I'm almost just wondering, it could give you a confidence of how likely it was that somebody, I don't want to call it like pre-selected the process, but right, you talked about that sort of I reported results selectively or I did many models or something. And it's if you think about how extreme your specification has to be, right? If you do have that sort of simulated specifications, you can see, okay, this person went way further than sort of 99.9% of other specifications. And that might make you a little suspicious or at least give you like a prior that maybe you need to look into it or do something else.
Yeah, there's a Augsburg and Brudel, so German last names. They've published a working paper that is a critique of our study. It's pretty harsh and feels a bit unfair, but they make some good points in that direction where they say what a couple of these models, they're just wild. And their suspicion is some of the teams want to really stand out in the study. So they just run crazy models that they wouldn't actually do in their real normal research process, even though we ask them to please behave as normal researchers. And that might be true. And so there might be an argument for trimming outliers here. And this could be something to think about. And we didn't do that. And maybe worth thinking about. Just coming back to one point you made, if you need more real world examples, I have a blog post where I participated in one of these meta science replications through the open science framework. And just for fun, I ran the replication in Stata and R. And what should have been the same logistic regression models had slightly different results. And I can't explain why. They're not hugely different, but still they're slightly different. And I report that in that blog post. And if you're into AI, if you have a different graphics card and you're running certain AI models, you're gonna, with all the same starting values, you're gonna possibly end up with different results.
Yeah. Other questions? Otherwise, I have a number, but I'll wait until everyone in the audience who has any questions. Feel free to, again, either just speak up or put it in the chat if you would prefer. Okay, I'll toss them out. We, as a researcher support center, we spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, where are people at currently? And what we see in terms of even getting comfortable with sharing data is quite variable across the social sciences within Canada, with a lot of the more mixed methods and qualitative disciplines being flat out very clear no's. Like, we're not going to share our data, no way, no how. And then even in the disciplines where, yes, people are actively sharing data, the quality of the coding, the nature of the ability to replicate because of the software issues, all of that is also very complex. And then the process of actually documenting researcher decisions. And I had been very hopeful right up until reading your study that sort of much better documentation of researcher decisions was one of the sort of key things that needed to happen to be able to really advance the ability to replicate studies and open science. And yeah, I'm a lot less confident in that. So I'm curious how you see this relative to these very early steps in trying to bring about a more open science. And then, yeah, this now giant mountain that awaits us in all of the uncertainty that none of those things can help to manage.
I like that you brought up qualitative research in particular. I think so. Really high quality qualitative research, in my understanding, has everything is incredibly well prepared before the research takes place. And a complete research plan is outlined, and the researcher even might be like explicitly dealing with their own biases as they go into the field and trying to figure out how to fit those into the research process in the best way. And then after the fact, I learned this. I work a lot with quantitative methods, but this was qualitative research in analyzing the team's workflows. And for example, when not all teams agreed to have just their code as they submitted it shared because they thought, oh, we might have mistakes in there, or maybe other teams look, smarter than us, and fine. So then I had to redact everything, and it was like, wow, and the identifying features are, so people would have their drive name with their name. So I was like, so-and-so's name / replication / and these things all had to be redacted and altered. And yeah, the point is that there has been traditionally this complaint by researchers working with qualitative methods that quantitative researchers have the ability, researchers using quantitative methods. I don't like label qualitative researcher, quantitative researcher. Researchers using quantitative methods can publish more papers and get more done because it's easier to just run the models and everything. That I don't think that's true, but I think it was true in practice, or has been true in practice, because quantitative researchers using quantitative methods have been just quick. They've acted in ways that are really fast, and hasn't been any kind of control. Whereas if I understand correctly, getting published like in the top qualitative method oriented journals, you have to have all this stuff super well documented. And it could take like an entire PhD time worth of work to get to this one publication, to have all the data documented so that a reviewer would look at it and say, okay, everything is in order here. And with the quantitative method based studies, I think a lot of reviewers just took the results at face value. when in fact, we now know that there's so much mess behind the scenes going on. In addition, and let's forget it for a moment about all the perverse incentives and hacking, just the mess that takes place behind the scene. I taught a course where we replicated a study in the course, and I made the mistake of not replicating it myself beforehand. And with these graduate students, there were all these mistakes in the code and all this stuff, and we couldn't quite come to the same results. And actually, the more I try to replicate different studies, the more there's all these little things in the workflow that's a little sloppy or it doesn't quite replicate. And yes, if we're really going to take ourselves seriously and help to recover our image in the public, I think we need to train those using quantitative methods to behave in many ways like those who are trained in qualitative methods, which is to have this very, like, every step needs to be documented in the research process. And ideally, it would be great when, those of you who have published, you ask this, do you have a conflict of interest? And you have to tick a box. No, I have no conflict of interest. We should all honestly have to say, actually, I'm really interested in publishing because I need it for my own status and my career. And so that might bias my results. That would be the honest answer, but that's it. So I'm not sure if that directly answered your question, but a little bit of a tangent.
No, it absolutely did. And it made me think more about what you were saying about the importance of theory in this, linking it to the conversation about qualitative methods, because to me, that's one of the major distinguishers, is that one of the joys of working with quant is you can just go nuts with the data set and you don't have to have a theoretical background behind what you're looking at. Whereas in qualitative research, exactly because you're building out the protocols from the very beginning, you have to have a foundation. You can't you really shouldn't just go nuts on asking people questions. So it's interesting. I'm trying to think, because you do have the perverse incentive, what it actually looks to try to introduce some of that essentially discipline and slowing down into how methodology is taught, into the expectations for researchers in top journals. Have you thought at all about what it looks like to begin to encourage that pragmatically?
Yeah, I have a lot of personal opinions on this topic. It's a little bit away from this particular paper, but I think so. I've decided or pledged that I won't review papers anymore unless I get the data and workflow so that I can look at what they did. I realize that some data cannot be shared for various reasons, whether they're ethical or costs or not having the license to share it. That's fine. But then I still would want to see the workflow and the code so that I can look at it and understand what they did. Because what I've learned is that what's reported in papers, and a lot of times it's not intentional on the researcher's part. Of course, there are people with nefarious motives, but some are just not intentional. They think they're reporting what they did, and they aren't actually. When you go and look at their models, it's slightly different than what they've reported. And that's one thing that I think we should all do. So I'm like, yeah, this could be like an R&R, but I won't agree to publish it until I've seen the data and code, when I know the data could be shared with me. Another idea that I think might be worth pursuing, we have evidence of its value. The American Journal of Political Science in 2015 or 16 started checking the results of every paper using quantitative methods, and it had to run and it had to produce the results. And what happened was, in the first year, not a single study's code ran and produced the results. They had to have an average of almost 2 interactions with the exchanges with the authors to get the code to actually run. And so we should take this very seriously. Okay, time out, everybody. We need to really clean up our act here. And I think other journals should do that when they can. Now, this is a human capital intensive activity, having people who they have the money they're a really top journal. They have the money to outsource it to a third party to check these models. But my idea, this is my idea. Let's say we have 3 reviewers per paper. 2 should be the substantive reviewers and 1 should be the methods reviewer. And the methods reviewer will say, okay, I say nothing about theory, data generating model, et cetera. I just look at the methods. I check that it's replicable. I see if the decisions in the methods fit with what they are reporting. And then Because for a modern reviewer to look at theory, think about all the literature that's out there and to overproof the methods and try to replicate the findings, we're talking about 2 days of work, maybe more if it's a really sloppy code and whatnot. And nobody can commit to that. So if we had a special, okay, you're the methods reviewer and you two are the general theory literature reviewers, I think that would be really helpful. But I think the only way things are really going to change is if we change the incentive structure. And that is one of the hardest things to change. This will sound radical, but I think we have to get rid of for-profit publishing. I I support what the service that publishers have provided, and some publishers do an amazing job. I don't want to go against that, but as long as we have for-profit publishing, we have this problem where, Elsevier like copyrights everything and forces us to do all the work to produce stuff. And then we have to pay all this money to read our own work. It's silly. The other idea is to abolish journals and just have working papers. But then we need a system where people somehow can read the papers. And yeah, there are no easy solutions, but we certainly I want to try to train the next future researchers to think about these problems and take them seriously. And I hope that they get rewarded at some point. So having a really great workflow, openly shared, easily reproducible, maybe virtual computing environment. These are really probably the key to reproducibility, virtual computing environment. Having that stuff would be like rewarded where people would say, okay, this researcher is serious. We can trust their work.
Thank you so much. I feel like we could keep talking for a long time, but I'm aware we are out of time. Yes, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so
Thanks
much for
again
having me.
coming.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to contact me for further discussion, I'm always available. It's a pleasure.
Nate, I'll send you. We had a wonderful talk with Lars Hoover, who did led all of the replications for American Economics Association journals, and
Oh,
his
wow.
reflections as the person who led, I think it was like over 10,000 replications, were really fascinating.
I
So I'll
bet.
send you that
And
video.
is it next week? You have a really interesting looking talk also about replicability. Yeah.
Yes. So we've been focusing on this area for about 2 years now and realizing how complex it is and how differential it is across social sciences. And what you were talking about, how much they can all learn from each other. So we've gone heavy into really trying to unpack this and help researchers be able to find new directions to be able to work with all this uncertainty.
I think that's great. I am a big fan.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Nate. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.